Hey, I'm Scott.
And I'm Chris.
And this is Doxalogic, where we help you think with your Bible.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Doxalogic. Pastor Scott, we are here. It is starting to feel like fall around here, a little bit early.
It is, surprisingly, for our area.
We're recording this in early September, and we hit the low 80s, a little bit of rain.
Yeah.
What did your wife ask about Christmas?
She wanted to have Christmas music on in September.
Christmas come early.
We had to have a sit down conversation.
Not gonna happen. Not gonna happen, honey.
Yeah. She wants it bad though. And then she came out wearing a sweater that looked like fall.
Right.
You know when you can just look at something and you're like, yeah, it has all the colors.
Starbucks has got their fall stuff.
Pumpkin bagels in our house already. Yeah, if you get a pumpkin latte, for sure, she's in on that.
Oh, I love it. Well, hey, we are joined today by a special guest, Dr. Greg Lanier. Dr. Lanier, hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you guys.
Yeah, I really appreciate you giving us some time. We'll get into the specific topic in a moment, which is going to actually be a conversation about artificial intelligence, AI. So excited about that, but would love to just start with some background about just personally your upbringing, your coming to faith in Christ, and then even your journey to being where you are today as far as seminary teaching, and I'll let you introduce all of that if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, man. I'll just go in reverse order, I suppose. So right now I'm in Florida. My full-time job is associate pastor of New Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary here in Orlando, one of several campuses of RTS. I'm also the dean of Global, which is part of the reason why I got interested in artificial intelligence, our online campus. And then my nights and weekends gig is associate pastor at a Presbyterian church in Lake Mary, Florida, just north of Orlando. Married to Kate. We have 3 daughters. And our time is spent with sports and kids' activities and a dog and all kinds of things like that. I've been at RTS. This is now I'm in my 8th year, having studied overseas in England. Went to RTS Orlando prior to that. I did grow up in North Carolina. I'm a Tar Heel by affiliation. My wife and I met at UNC Chapel Hill, and but in terms of my spiritual path, the whole sort of how did I become a seminary prof? That's a whole long story. But in terms of my sort of upbringing, my parents are in North Carolina. I grew up in the church, kind of a standard, never knew a day when I didn't know Jesus kind of story, which is great.
Praise
what you
God.
want for your kids, but it doesn't sell books whenever you're like in this ministry in college. I'm like, I'm never picked to share my testimony because it's kind of, it's not, I guess, sort of a big kind of thing, but it is big in God's eyes. So yeah, that's kind of the basic background.
Praise God. I love that. You know, the more and more I go, my kids get older, the more I treasure that kind of testimony. And the more I want that for our families,
That's right.
And it is powerful. So super encouraging to have a faithful lineage where you can look to your parents and parents' for how they followed Christ and led by that example and shepherded in the home and all that. That's awesome.
Yeah. And I grew up in the Moravian church, which is maybe that's a bit more unusual.
Okay.
A lot of listeners may not know what that is, but it's a very small Protestant denomination that goes back. It actually predates the Protestant Reformation, formally speaking. Their kind of founder was one of the earliest Reformation martyrs, who was a big Jan Hus, who was a big inspiration for some of the later reformers. So it goes back a long way. It's just not terribly big.
Yeah. Is that the same as Moravian Brethren?
It does have a Brethren kind of element in its DNA.
Okay.
Looks sometimes, and the Moravians are actually very influential on John Wesley. That's also one of the big claims to fame. So it has kind of a Methodist feel, but it is just fundamentally kind of Presbyterian in polity, Reformed in doctrine. But it has a mix of other elements. Big in the Caribbean, big in the sort of New England part of the world, but not super well known outside of that. Anyway.
Yeah, that's an introduction to me.
Yeah,
I have not ever heard of that, in fact. Well, thank you. Hey,
you have to go to Wikipedia and find out about the Moravians.
Yeah, there you go. To learn more. Yeah, Wikipedia. What's something, before we jump into our topic here, just being a seminary professor, it'd be interesting to know what's something interesting or surprising about being a professor at a seminary that a lot of folks wouldn't know?
Probably, especially when I compare it to the church job, the church vocation. One of the things that it's starting to hit me more and more with each passing year that I don't think I expected, although I probably should have, is the turnover. where it's designed for students to come in and spend 3 to 4 years here. You get to know them and their families, and then if everything goes well, they leave. And so I keep getting older, and they all stay the same age.
Sure.
And that's a new thing for me. And with each passing year, I'm in my 40s now, I'm finding myself in that weird position where I'll have like some quality, like very good movie reference from the late 90s. I don't signal it. I just crush it. It's Anchorman or Braveheart or something like that.
Sure.
And it just goes over the heads of most of them. It's like, oh, right. You were born in 2000, weren't you? You have no idea what I'm talking about. So that's becoming
brutal,
a huge burden in my life. And the 90s, because I'm diehard Gen Xer. And so that's been new. I mean, so there's the generational thing, but there's also just the turnover, which is how we're designed. But every year it's like you see, your the students that you've invested in go and spread their wings and fly, and you die 1,000 deaths. But it's a good thing, but it's sad too. So I didn't anticipate that. I think maybe it's because I'm getting older. I'm feeling that more and more.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's so great. Yep.
Yeah.
We can relate to that.
Yeah, I'm getting there.
Yeah.
No doubt. I'll be 40
you
next year
experience
myself.
that in church life, just not as rapidly, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Hopefully folks stick around for more than 3 years, but with the seminary, that's the design. And
Right.
so they're going to leave.
And with church life, they age with you, right? Versus you're getting that same age group and you're the one getting older. Everyone else is coming in at, whatever young 20s, depending on where they're at, for the most part in life, getting that MDiv or that MA or whatever, starting their grad school career. That's fascinating.
Well, hey, let's jump into the topic at hand here, AI. And Dr. Lanier, there's plenty of reason we can get into that, why we reached out to you to teach us about this and ask questions to you, because you've been studying this for some time. But let's start at kind of the 30,000-foot view, just a definition, a working definition of artificial intelligence. What is it?
What is it? Yeah. And I'll say at the outset, I'm not an expert in this field. I got into it, and we can talk about that in a minute. I got into it almost from both a pastoral and a professor perspective, just to kind of be aware of what's going on and think through the implications. So it's not like my specialty. So I'll caveat it with that. But perhaps maybe if nothing else, that means what I've gone through is probably what a lot of other folks should go through who are vocationally in ministry of some sort of getting up the curve. Because I do think there are some big implications, but I'm definitely not the leading expert. In a nutshell,
well, you are in the room today. You are.
Artificial intelligence fundamentally is using computers or other devices, computers embedded on phones or what have you, or even machines, to do tasks typically associated with what human capabilities are. And that's partly intelligence stuff. So pattern recognition, reasoning, data, assimilation, computation, analysis, predictions, and so on. But it can include other more physical tasks that typically have been the domain of humans. So that's fundamentally what it is. And so it started, even long before, we were adults. You had a baby phase of AI that would be like the computer that could beat your chess grandmaster.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Right. That's, those kinds of things were early days of AI, very complicated, massive computers that were, quote unquote, smart enough. And what we mean by that is they were programmed in a sophisticated way to be able to adapt and change, and not just like do 2 + 2 = 4, but they can actually play a game and beat humans. And then it's gone from there to the ability to generate images with photorealistic quality that don't actually exist, right? No one took that photo, or to generate music, to generate videos. And probably the most popular application, of course, right now is to generate text of various sorts. And it's just doing it in a way that mimics, for lack of a better term, what historically has been perceived as like human creativity and rationale and thinking. So, we grew up with calculators that could do pretty amazing stuff, but this is just a whole new wave of capabilities that's in many respects surprised a lot of people that we've gotten there this fast. So that's in essence what AI is.
And you've gotten into this a little bit in terms of, found out about what, your investment in this through Dr. Ligon Duncan's Twitter profile, where he kind of put out some of the resources that you have contributed to on this topic. Even though you say you're not an expert, a lot of people have been very encouraged and helped by what you have produced. So can you give us a little sense of what does that work look like? What has been behind this, though you would consider it not an expert's,
Sure, yeah.
A perspective, but your own?
Yeah. I mean, if Ligon says I'm an expert, then I guess I
That
am.
settles it. Yeah.
Who's to say no to the boss?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It actually doesn't go back to Ligon. Early this year, maybe late last year, my boss here at RTS Orlando, Mike Allen, our academic dean, reached out to me and said, part of my background is computer science, so I studied computer science at UNC Chapel Hill back before it was cool. And it was decidedly uncool back in the early 2000s because of the .com bust that my students currently don't even know about. So I was programming before it was interesting. And he said, hey, you have a computer bent. Could you spend just a few hours looking into specifically ChatGPT? Because that was just like in December starting to make the news. Like, what are the implications for us at RTS in particular? What should we be thinking about in terms of our syllabi? Should we modify them to talk about AI? How's this going to impact papers and plagiarism? He was asking me to look at it purely from an RTS professor perspective. And so I got a subscription to ChatGPT, started playing around with it. And that's when I started thinking, this is around sort of January, February, after I was doing the research. I put on my pastor hat and I said, you know what, this is actually going to be a pretty big deal. Not that I'm a prophet by any means, but if you think back over the past 5 years or so, we've had NFTs, the Bored Ape images that people pay ungodly amounts of money for, and cryptocurrency. And these things have come and said, hey, this is going to change everything. And I wasn't entirely convinced about this, certainly not about NFTs. Crypto, we'll see. But I was like, this seems legit. Like this, I think, is going to be a game changer, which I in general, I'm kind of a cynic when it comes to that kind of stuff. And so I said, I owe it to my church, because I oversee adult education at the church, one of the hats I wear. I said, it would make a lot of sense for us to get ahead on this and start helping people think through the implications, not just from what are the kids at UCLA going to be doing to cheat on their term papers? That's one question. But what are the broader societal implications of this? And so I started digging into deep fakes, and I actually deep faked myself.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Which was quite fun and also terrifying.
Yeah.
I just, I bought a subscription to one of the audio deepfake systems that you just feed it some MP3s of yourself, and it clones your voice, and you type up a script, and it reads it out like you, and then you can sort of mess with it and tweak it to kind of make it better and better.
Wow.
5 minutes later, I had a 2-minute clip of myself talking, and my wife in the next room thought it was me. And then you listen to it closely. It's like, oh, it's not exactly me, but it's pretty close, actually. Like, it's enough to fool certain people. So started getting into that and AI art and sort of thinking through all this stuff. And so essentially what I did that spring was I just started out with a 4-week series with our church, because after 4 weeks, I was out of things to say, because it's like, this is still so new and we don't know where it's all going to go. But I wanted to walk through not just here's all the stuff that's out there, which by itself was actually really overwhelming for a lot of our people. When I played the deepfake audio, I deepfaked our senior pastor. I had his approval. I'm creating children's book pictures and stories, and you may have seen there's this Beatles song that was produced by Sony that's entirely AI generated, but it sounds like a pretty decent Beatles song. And so I'm demoing all this stuff, and you can just see about 100 people in the class, like the panic on people's faces, because most of them had no idea that this was capable, that these capabilities are out there. It just so happened that week was when you had Elon Musk go sort of DEFCON 9 on this. You had Bill Gates write his letter saying this is going to be game changing. You had Wozniak saying this is going to be terrible, or good or bad, depending on who you ask, right? Everyone starts kind of panicking, because that was when ChatGPT just hit the news, and everybody is seeing every headline on CNN and MSNBC and Fox. They're all talking about AI, and it's perfect timing for my Sunday school class. But what I really wanted to do, and I think that's part of the reason why we wanted to have this conversation, is say, okay, it's cool to see the bells and whistles, and that's neat, right? There's a toy aspect of this. Oh, let me just tell ChatGPT to write a a song about hamburgers in the style of Taylor Swift, which is what my daughter wanted me to do. And it did a great job. It's one thing to do that. It's another thing to sort of think through what are the theological implications of this.
Right.
And that's what I spent the next 3 weeks on. What questions does this next wave of technology raise about who we are as humans, moral risks, and so forth? How do we interact with technology? Those are the kinds of things that I wanted to probe. And it's really interesting because as I was teaching on it, I was having people come up to me afterwards who probably didn't want to out themselves necessarily, at least not in front of the whole room. But like, yeah, by the way, I've been using this stuff at work for a couple of months now. Like I use it all the time for programming or for legal stuff or what have you. And, they weren't sure if that was good or bad, but they're like, this is, and I realized, wow, this is actually even more embedded in the life of the people than probably I even realized. So ended up being kind of the right timing to go over it. From there, I presented some of this stuff to the deans at RTS, and that's when Ligon tweeted it. So, and that's been kind of the end of the story. I have integrated some stuff into my courses, but for now it's kind of like, okay, let's see how it's going to play out from here. That's kind of where I am.
Yeah,
that's the kind of longish version.
That
of the
is
answer.
Fascinating. It really is.
I was waiting to deep fake you at some point, Scott. So
well,
you can plan on that
it's
coming.
going to sound very similar. I was just thinking even in a court of law, and what you could get someone to admit to, or how you're going to be able to validate that this is someone's actual voice.
Let alone pictures.
Pictures,
right?
right?
Yeah. Evidence, audio evidence, images.
Well, you may remember it was, I think, the second week of this series when the Trump arrest photos came out. Do you remember that hitting the news?
Yes.
The first round of indictments, and on social media, a handful of photos of him being physically arrested and handcuffed went around, and millions of people thought they were real, but they had been entirely deep fake. You could tell if you looked at the fingers, but if you weren't looking at the fingers, because there were like 6 fingers, it convinced a lot of people. And so it was perfect for Sunday school, because I was like, this is the issue. One of the issues is the blurring, and we'll get into some of that stuff, but the blurring of reality and what is real.
Right.
And so that really, I think, opened people's eyes. Like this is a big deal. Now, frankly, it's almost like the first wave has gone through, and you have no idea at this point, frankly, if you're seeing a banner ad on the internet now, it's incredibly difficult to know whether that's an AI generated image of somebody playing with a thing or a real person, because it's gotten so good in the past 6 months that it would be virtually impossible unless you have access to the code behind it, because some of the producers are trying to put in essentially watermarks in the code to identify it as AI generated, but otherwise it would be virtually impossible to trace at this point. It's gotten that good that fast, which is kind of exciting and also very terrifying.
It is. And we were even joking back and forth on email that by the time we got to this podcast, everything that you had researched would be completely obsolete.
Well, partly because when I did the research, it was the prior iteration of ChatGPT, and then it came out with a new one and will continue to do so. And then Bard was coming out, the Google stuff, and Microsoft. So anyway, a lot has happened in the meantime, of course.
So in the midst of kind of an ever-changing landscape that will be hard to keep up with for anybody, even if you're a guy who's in this. Tries. Yeah. It's going to be difficult. So I feel like the best place to kind of start is what can we kind of establish as an unchanging foundation in terms of our understanding? So I'm thinking, let's go, what does the Bible have to say about artificial intelligence directly or indirectly? What does the doctrine of anthropology, the doctrine of man, have to do to play into our understanding? What are some unchanging principles that maybe we can start with as we, try to navigate through an ever-changing, technological landscape?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. It was interesting whenever I was messing around with this deep fake. It was actually after I had preached, and I used my sermon MP3 to deep fake myself. And my kids came in to where I was in our room, and I was playing around with the computer, and they heard it, and they were like, so they were sort of kicking the tires, what's going on, and telling me to tweak and do these different things. And one of my daughters, I think it's my oldest daughter, said, "So, Dad, if this ChatGPT plus 11 Labs, the other stuff I was using, it's like, if it can do that stuff, what do humans do?" And I was like, that is the question. Like, she just went straight to the perfect question.
Yep.
Because I think the gut level reaction that folks have to both the kind of, oh, this is really neat, and also the, oh, wow, this is kind of terrifying Terminator landscape. If some of your listeners know Terminator, not everyone will. I can't assume that anymore.
Gen X and all. Yep.
Yeah, it does fundamentally raise the question of what does make us special as humans, if anything. And of course, part of the challenge is a lot of the folks who are really pushing the development of AI don't operate from a biblical framework, and there fundamentally isn't anything special about humans from their perspective. But anyway, getting ahead of myself, Scripture doesn't talk about AI itself, of course, nor does it talk about automobiles or modern technology. But it is quite interesting that when you see, for instance, like Tubal Cain show up in Genesis, and he's kind of the godfather of technology, but then uses it for nefarious ends. And then you read about kind of in the present age of darkness that we're in, prior to the return of Jesus, humanity, especially unregenerated humanity, is bent towards using all of our wisdom, all of our intelligence, all of our technology for largely destructive ends. If God were to pull his hand away entirely, right? Because of common grace, we have made lots of advances that are good for the flourishing of humanity. But in general, what we do is we have technology that we use for destructive ends. And so that, to me, I think is one of the big biblical perspectives. We all know, based on how we use web browsers, cell phones, whatever it might be, cars, we can, unchecked by the power of the Holy Spirit, use those good technologies for both soul crushing, but also just directly sinning against others ends. And so for me, one of the key biblical principles is just being a reminder, to be a reminder that, yeah, this is pretty neat that we can do this as humans, but we could also build the Tower of Babel, and we can do things that are very harmful. And only really a biblical anthropology chastens us from kind of going all in and saying, yes, let's do this as fast as we can. It's like, actually, wait a second. We aren't, it's not a guarantee that we're going to use this technology in a moral, godly way. So that's one thing in terms of one of the things that's been interesting to see the broader discussion in terms of folks saying, hey, we need Congress to regulate this, or we need an international organization to come up with the rules for this. And that's what the big figures, even the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, is pushing for. On the one hand, that's actually sort of borrowing from a Christian perspective that actually we're gonna use this toy for bad ends if we don't have a mom and a dad telling us what to do, right? Mm-hmm. And so whether we should trust some central body to come up with the right rules is a different issue. But I think there is a sense that most folks have, like, this could go wrong in a lot of different ways. And then the other question, I think, that especially at church, especially with younger people who are going to be far more advanced in their use of this, because that's always true, but also the next generation is just going to grow up with this. This is going to be the air they breathe. I think it's incumbent upon pastors and parents, other folks, children's ministry leaders, youth leaders, those kinds of folks, to get back to the basics of what is special about you as a human that makes you different than the machines, which sounds crazy to even say it that way, but that's kind of where we are. And it's not assumed anymore, I think, outside of the church that humans are special. Because fundamentally, AI can think faster than I am, at least I can, at least on certain tasks. And so what is special about me? I can imagine a generation of people 10 years from now who, having come out of already a severe sense of isolation and depression and so forth that we're already in, but 10 years from now, I don't even know what I am as a human anymore. Like, that's a real profound question. I think Scripture does have very good answers for that, so long as we're preaching and teaching it. So in terms of human image bearing, human capacity for true creativity, human capacity for real relationships, which involves hurt. A chat bot on your phone is never going to replace a real person that can both love and hurt. There's actually risk in those kind of relationships, but that makes them real. Those kinds of things to kind of get back to those very basic elements. But that requires embodied presence at church. That requires investing in one another. It's not going to be an obvious thing. So anyway, those are some of the kind of biblical principles that I think can establish some guardrails for us.
You bring up something very interesting about the generation behind us, so to speak, whether that's maybe 15 or so year olds, but they're going to be native. Like AI will be native to them. It'll be the language they speak growing up. They won't know a time without it. Like I do remember, I was probably 12 or so years old. Our first time we had a computer with internet. The difference feels like that took maybe not a decade, but a number of years to really get as ubiquitous as the internet now is. Whereas this has happened at breakneck speed by comparison. This has been, we can say it's been decades in the making, right? Like you can look at people in the probably 70s, 80s, people forecasting this, the movies that seemed so, whether Terminator or other things, right? So out there, but then now that it's hit, it's been stunning to see the breakneck speed of it. And so
the shocking thing is you look at the iPhone and it is approaching 20 years old.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah. And yes, and Android, as the analog, a lot of advancements have been made with the iPhone, cameras, speed, et cetera. It can do a lot more than it used to be able to do. Fundamentally, it's still a approximately 5.5 inch diagonal slab of plastic, glass, and metal and silicone. In 20 years, it hasn't. Now we have we have folding ones. I guess that's been our big innovation. But if you look at AI in the past 5 years, and I did a comparison for the Sunday school, 5 years ago, AI could generate essentially a stick figure. Like you could tell it, draw a picture of a person, and it was smart, which by the way was phenomenal that it could do that. Like you're not telling it how to, it's just doing it, right? It could draw a stick figure. 5 years later, you can produce a 10 megabyte high res picture of Harry Styles and what he will look like 20 years from now. That doggone, I'm like, yeah, he's definitely going to look like that in 20 years. Like it's crazy what they're able. And so in 5 years versus 20 years for the iPhone, that is still basically the same thing. So you're right. One of the big questions that some of the technology folks have asked is, can humanity accommodate the pace of change? We long term we can. When I was a kid, we had graphing calculators come out, and my parents were teachers, and everyone's like, "Oh man, the graphics got the TI-85 when that came out." You may remember that.
Oh yeah.
Everyone's like, "Math is over, right? We are no longer going to have to do math." Yeah. And we adapted, we got better. Now we integrate it into our workflow, but it takes 20 years, right? And so with this, the step function change, I think, is what has partly panicked people. It's like to my knowledge, we've never had this kind of revolutionary technology happen this quickly. The internal combustion engine, we're still tinkering with it over 100 years later. Electric cars have actually been around for a long time. They've just now finally gotten pretty decent. So, but we're talking about, in a blink of an eye on a human time scale. And that it is interesting. That's why it feels so disorienting. Like, can humanity accommodate that kind of change that quickly? Because we're actually pretty slow to adapt in general.
It's that disorienting sense about the change.
Yeah.
Again,
which then leads to the fear of like, I'm going to lose my job and blah, blah, blah. So
right.
That's been a big reaction. It's like, well, I don't need to be a lawyer anymore if GPT can write my briefs. So.
And all this technology continues to put the youngest people in the driver's seat of use and expertise without the wisdom that comes with those who are older to kind of shape that.
Yeah, well, because you're 50. In general, your late career programmer is not going to be, in general, this is an overstatement, but not going to be versed in the technologies that are going into sort of under the hood, because it's the 18-year-olds that are driving it. They're the ones who can do it. So yeah, you're right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'd love to dive into that image bearer component and how important it is to understand being made in the image of God. Because one of the things that struck me as you were talking was perhaps a tie into, this identity crisis we're facing in our broader culture. Obviously, guys like Carl Trueman have written about this, and just fundamentally, without any grounding in being an image bearer of God, already lacking an identity, and then this technology sweeping through faster than most people can critically think about this. Why is it so important to have a firm understanding of being an image bearer specifically when it comes to how to navigate artificial intelligence?
Yeah. My hypothesis would be, if you look at virtually every other technology category for as far back as the biblical days, in general, what technology has been used for is to make human life easier and better, whether that's the wheel or the inclined plane or combustion engine, air conditioning, whatever it might be, personal computers. It was always to kind of like help humans reach their best potential. And I think it's fairly, as a Christian, it's fairly easy to make the connection. Okay, that's a good gift of God. Vaccines, having doctors to heal things, artificial hips, whatever it might be. Like that's good. Like that contributes to humans being a largely benevolent force in the world and creation mandate that we've been told to care for the earth and all those kinds of things. And that I think most folks can wrap their head around that. The thing that and it's actually the definition that we were talking about at the very beginning. When you really internalize what AI is trying to do, is essentially, or at least maybe the fear is, it's fundamentally not helping human, or at least it's not designed in its essence to merely help humans, like having a blender make your smoothies. That's helpful. It's trying to mimic humans, and that I think is what really causes people to pause and say, well, wait a second, if it's actually thinking, if it's writing, if it's creating, or at least seems to be creating, if it can now drive a car where I used to be the one who would drive the car, if it's running air traffic control, landing planes, if it's an app that can now diagnose my condition and replace my doctor, like, okay, hold on a second, that seems to have gone a little bit too far, right? So that's, I think, the heart of it is, okay, what do humans do that the AI is at least trying to mimic or replace? And so it's interesting, if you ask most folks sort of what being an image bearer entails, a lot of folks will say, well, we can think. That's true. We can, obviously, or the ability to reason. And I think that's part of it. But, other creatures have a form of that, of course. And no doubt AI can reason in a sense that it can take inputs and produce outputs. And so I've been trying to think harder. It's like, well, there's got to be something more. And I think one of the key things that can never really be replicated by AI, and this is where I think we take the conversation with people, is we are not simply computers with bodies, because AI can do that, right? We're actually souls that have the capacity to worship God or not, right? To harm others and repent, to love others in a real way that involves risks, that involves sort of the messiness that makes life different and special. And that, I think, is fundamentally, like, that's where we want to get back to, is you have a particular identity as a soul. And I think you're right. Modernity has not helped us cultivate that with people, because so many of the factors in the broader life, especially for young people, have been eroding that sense of I'm a special and unique soul to God. Like, that's not the message that most kids are getting on TikTok, right? And so, but I think that's where we have the work to do. That's fun. It's not so much thinking that makes us human, although there's a huge element of that. That can be replicated. It's the soul aspect and the relatable aspect that can't actually be replicated. But that is a uniquely Christian position. I mean, okay, Judaism and Islam probably would have a similar view. It's a uniquely not secular position to believe that a human actually has a soul that can worship God and relate to other people in a transcendent way that will actually pass death. That is a profound difference from a kind of secular world, Darwinian worldview, and that makes it different and important. So, I mean, there's probably more we could say, but I think that's where I'm trying to think. Okay, with even my own kids, how do I nurture that aspect? Because AI is going to be better at writing a paragraph about Homer's Iliad, book 1, than I am, and it'll be faster. But there's something about me writing that paragraph that nourishes my soul. You see what I'm trying to get at there? Yep. Not just the output of the intelligence; it's actually the soul formation that's happening.
And that very thing is what I've numerous times already talked with people about when it comes to sermon planning, sermon study, sermon delivering, right?
You haven't written a sermon on your own in a while, though, right, Chris? ChatGPT's been writing those?
That's not public information, Scott.
Sorry about
information. I'm your test subject before you start to stop preparing for your own sermons, right?
I'm going to take that. I'm going to take that clip, and I can now put that on.
You made me go first so that you could know how safe it is.
Yes.
But anyways, the idea of soul formation to the pastor, right? Whether or not I've heard, for example, prepare a 20-minute sermon off of Philippians 2, such and such, in the voice of well-known person, John Piper, R.C. Sproul, and it can by and large nail it. You would tweak only pieces of it, and you've saved yourself 80% of the time it would have otherwise taken you to study it, to dwell on it, to write it, and all of that. But what's missing, of course, over time, if not only even one time, is that important, your relationship to the Lord through the Word of God, and then to bring that to His people. And so that's just a full stop, like whether or not it has any function as a tool, like a Logos or some other software, which can save you much time, right? You don't need 8 commentaries on your desk and flipping to it. You can quickly access the information. That's one thing in terms of saving time. But
that's the older use of technology, right? That's the technology that's helping you be faster, which is good.
Yes.
Not replacing you, which is bad.
Right. I do want to ask, though, because this goes to doomsday so fast for many people, what do you see as a good or even a few possible good ends to incorporating AI, even as Christians specifically, that you would say, hey, let's not go full doomsday. Let's consider the way this is a blessing in the sovereignty of God and His providence that He's put you on this earth at this time, with these things happening, and you can harness at least some of this for God glorifying means.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. I do think Christian and non-Christian alike, the initial reaction in the first half of this year was largely to smash the panic button. Not everyone did, but even your Elon Musk, and then of course a lot of them had ulterior motives because they're secretly developing AI on their own. But that was the gut reaction. Is to panic. And so, in fact, my second Sunday school, I said before, I was like, I made you panic this past Sunday. Today, we're going to talk about the goods, and then we'll talk about the bads, but let's talk about the goods. And so I think that is a healthy conversation, because we don't want, as Christians, to be Luddites that just run away from technology just on some principle that we should be anti-technology, even though, of course, we have our phones at church and use that to open up the Bible and those kinds of things. We're inconsistent on that front. In terms of where could AI go that is advantageous to humanity, continuing to use technology in a way that is supplemental, not replacing itself. Medical research, I think, is a big area. My wife is an optometrist, and a lot of what an optometrist does, or a dentist or a medical doctor, especially on the primary care side, the diagnosis side, a lot of what they do is pattern recognition. Fundamentally, you're drawing on, if you're the doctor that has 40 years of experience, you've seen tens of thousands of patients. And it's like, okay, doc, I have this, and this. What is my problem? And they're like, okay, in their brain, they are piecing together all of the patterns. This, and this. And say, okay, here are the 3 things this could be. But they do that fallibly, of course. And they got to go secretly. They go to their office and they look things up in their textbooks and all that kind of stuff, right? They ask WebMD. It happens. I think AI can actually be. My wife's very excited about AI. She's like, look, if we have in 4 or 5 years artificial intelligence that can actually have access to millions of patient scenarios, and here's the 15 things they had, and here's what they actually had, right? And can do a very quick pattern recognition to generate those 4 differential diagnoses, that would be game changing. And then what you can do with that is that will feed a process of antibiotic development, vaccine development, other medications. That, I think, in general, has a lot of good possibilities. You can then, I think, take that idea and you can roll that out across engineering, public safety, those other kinds of fields where the goods of AI, of quickly processing data, but doing it in a way that's not simply me feeding it to Microsoft Excel, but it can actually adapt and adjust and do some things that are much more high level. That could really be beneficial in certain fields, with a certain very tight set of parameters, right? And then even for an average person, I'm not sort of against certain uses of AI that are sort of labor saving productivity type tools. I think that'll be helpful. And that, certainly the congregants who've come up to me and say, hey, look, a lot of times I'll use GPT or something else to generate a first draft of 100 lines of code to do a certain thing. And then I test it out on my own and I tweak it, but it saved me an hour. And then I make it my own. It's like that's good. I think that's no different than going on some website and querying people to help you do that kind of stuff. So it's just a faster way of doing it. So I think there's a lot of labor saving type stuff. Using it to generate scenarios for interior design ideas, even recipe ideas, and even helping you to a certain degree with research. There's ways I think you can do that in a helpful way. In terms of self-driving and all that kind of stuff, I don't know. It kind of probably depends on how you grew up, but I'd like to have my hands on the wheel. But that's just me. Anyway, so I think there are some good use cases. You start to run into risk areas though pretty quickly. It all depends on it depends on who's the adult in charge, right? And that's the fundamental question that no one really has an answer for yet.
Wow. Yeah, it's just the idea of there's no neutrality comes to mind. AI is not inherently neutral in part because what you wire it for, so to speak, right? What you give it a predisposition. People have been posting screenshots of you ask one question about one certain political figure and it will give you something, and then you ask the same question about a different one and it refuses to answer. It asks an intentionally provocative question about one celebrity or again, political figure, and it just will only answer for one and not the other. And you say, again, the who's behind that. And that's a fairly benign example of what can get out of hand quickly. But there's no neutrality even with AI.
Yeah, I mean, so with the positives, there's obviously a lot of concerns that are almost directly derived from the positives. And I think it still goes back to this whole image bearers of God. So what you're describing right there is, I think, fundamentally, and one of the big risks of AI is this reality distortion idea, where it's like, okay, I'm asking, and the issue is, it's one thing to go ask ChatGPT something. You're talking to AI. In the next few months, if we're not already there, because it's hard to tell, you could be asking Google this, right? I mean, that's certainly their plan. And it's no longer going to be, here's a list of websites that you can go and find out about this political person that you want to learn more about, but it's just giving you the answer. And you're no longer in the world of like, I know I'm talking to an AI chatbot. And so that's fundamentally the question is, okay, there's going to be this reality distortion effect of what's real anymore. And how do I trust this information? It's already bad enough on the internet, and this is going to make it worse. And as I was doing the research for like biblical stuff that I know some things about as a specialist, one of the things that was the most bewildering about that process, and I think you can extrapolate this to politics, whatever, is I would say, okay, here's a question that I know the answer to, and I would ask it. And sometimes it would crush it. It's like, wow, that is amazing that it could do it that well. That's better than most of my students could do. It can pass my exams or whatever. Then I would ask it a different question, and I couldn't tell the difference as to when it would be good or bad. And it would be very persuasive, but wrong. And I know it's wrong because it might be something that I've researched or whatever, but it's like my aunt couldn't figure that out. She would just sort of take like, and I wouldn't blame her. It sounds very, convincing. Probably my students would find that to be very persuasive. And that's when I realized, like, wait a second, the issue isn't it's going to replace us in sort of being the arbiters of truth or not. It's that you're not always going to be able to tell the difference. That to me, I think has profound implications. And the other thing, and I don't know if you've seen it, but maybe it's because I've been doing a lot of research, but as I've spoken with counselors or with younger people, very quickly, virtually overnight, what we have now, and it feeds this situation that we're already in as a culture with smartphone addiction, that kind of stuff, is you have AI-enabled companions. There's a lot, Snapchat rolled one out and so on, where you're just talking to a buddy and they can ask very good questions. They can give answers. They sound like a real person. And we have a generation that's more open to that. But it actually is going a lot further. And you'll see ads here and there for apps that will generate photos. And not safe for work photos because they can. And you could have your own, you can start developing emotions for this AI girl or boy that sounds like a person that sends you pics of themselves. And you may have seen one of the biggest up and coming TikTok influencers on that app is actually an AI girl who does not exist, but sends out these, photos of herself. Millions of followers at this point, does not exist. And so it's like, wow, how did we go from, oh, it's neat to get it to answer a question about, to do a funny quote from Abraham Lincoln, but do it in the style of Donald Trump, to like, wow, I could have not healthy pictures of a girl who doesn't exist, who's also my best friend on my app. Like, that's in 6 months. Like that to me is staggering. And terrifying, actually. So I was telling my counseling class here at RTS, like, you are going to be pastoring or counseling the first generation of AI. I want to keep it PG-13, sex bot chat buddy addiction, the likes of which we've never seen before. And I didn't quite, so I said that like in April. I didn't realize by July it would be out there. So, at least in certain pockets of the internet. So those are some like deep, so that's where the technology can malform us in very serious ways. Or just like, I'm so used to having the computer do everything for me. Like that's a more benign thing, but still actually becomes kind of a soul crushing. It's like, we assign you a paper for a reason, not because we need to know the information, but because it does something to you.
Yep.
And if you're just letting the computer do it because it's just built into Google Docs now and no one can trace it, then what does education look like anymore? So those are some sort of like profound hazards that, frankly, I don't think anyone has good answers for yet, because again, it is so new and we don't know exactly where it's going to go. I mean, one of the things that's been weird about ChatGPT over the past 2 or 3 months is that most folks are saying it's gotten worse. It's gotten more inaccurate, more prone to hallucinate,
or more politicized, even, right, as well.
Yeah, like the quality's gone down, and the crazy thing is no one knows why, because they fundamentally don't know why it's working the way it is. And so those are the things that sort of blow your mind. It's like, how? Normally when you would go and fix the code, you'd know where to fix it. Now it's like, we have no idea what it's doing. I'm like, wow, that is a brave new world. I have no idea what to say about that.
Wow. Well, with the remaining time left here, just a couple of minutes as we get ready to conclude, I think it'd be interesting just to hear your perspective for the church, the American church, pastors. How should the church and pastors be prepared for just how AI will disrupt the way people do church, participate in church, community? What's a word that you would have for maybe generally the church and then pastors in particular?
It's hard to say at this point, because I do think culturally we're at this weird inflection where we've come out of a season, largely because of COVID, where a lot of experimentation happened with like how to do church. And it's hard to see what the kind of long-term impact of that's going to be, because you have simultaneously folks who are like, hey, I want to stay home, right? And others who are desperate to get back. And so it's hard to say, because it's going to be interacting with that. A recent book that's just come out by a friend of mine here in Orlando, Jim Davis and Mike Graham, called The Great De-Churching. Maybe you've seen it being advertised. One of their findings is, and I think it's good news, even though the de-churching is bad news. One of their findings is there does seem to be a statistically significant rise of people wanting just authentic, basic means of grace church. Like, they don't want the light, no offense if you have one, the light show and the smoke machines and the 27 person worship praise bands with 17 Instagram stories after the sermon. They want regular people in a church where they can get plugged in and serve, the preaching of the word. It's almost like going back to kind of just old school church. And their research suggests that's going to be a trend. And you've seen it, like, a lot of Baptists have gone Anglican in the past 10 years because they're like, we want something solid that's like liturgical and so forth. That's been one trend. And so if that's true, then actually in some respects, I'm not worried too much, because I could certainly see it, and I feel it myself, and my kids feel it. Sunday is an oasis from cell phones and technology and Zoom meetings. And that's certainly what we experienced at our church. Like, we're just glad to be back and to hear the music, right? I'm not on a screen. It allows me to take a break from that. And so I'm optimistic that however AI develops, there's going to be a desire, a hunger for like, no, what I really want is like actual humans. Could it go the other way, or could large sectors of the population go the other way? Sure. I mean, I could, like you mentioned, you could very easily develop an app over the next year that could create your own automated sermon podcast where you could give it a passage, give it Sinclair Ferguson or Tim Keller or whomever. It has enough audio of those people, although it would be a flagrant copyright violation. But of course, all of it is one massive copyright violation. That's a whole different issue. The whole thing is a copyright violation. But and you could generate like, here's your 30-minute sermon, and also here's a new worship song in the Kristen and Keith Getty style. Like the kind of doomsday scenarios that you could actually come up with like meta church that way. But whether folks are going to go for it, I don't know. One wonders if they're going to eventually kind of burn out with the toy and just want to get back to regular church. To the extent that anyone wants to go to church, it's going to be old school in that sense, would be my guess. But I don't know. Well, I think it's too early to really know where it's going to break, and it'll probably be some combination of all these things. But I'm not actually super worried about church. I'm more worried about education and like what I'm going to be dealing with at church with wounded people, just that are wounded in a way that's different than in the past. It's
Sure.
one thing to have this kind of sin area that I have a category for that I can work with on. It's a different thing to say, wow, I didn't see that coming. That's very different. So that to me as a pastor is sort of what I'm more thinking about. Anyway.
I feel like it could go both ways, just knowing that there's such a push for being connected to large, famous, fast-growing churches and pastors and all that stuff. So it probably falls on both sides. People not wanting that, going back to what you said, kind of more of a historic, rooted, age-old Christian faith. But some probably that will get swept into the new version of what's popular.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Dr. Lanier, we have just really been blessed by your time, and you don't have to call it expertise, but certainly a level of knowledge and thoughtfulness that you've put into this.
For looking into this.
Yeah, that our people who listen to this will benefit from, and many more. We're going to link in the show notes to your church's resource page in terms of the MP3s and the PDFs that I know Scott and I have already seen, and we're very grateful for just for people to continue to consider this, continue to pray about how the Lord would have us interact with this in this new day and age. So really appreciate your time, sir.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I do hope, if nothing else, it doesn't cause your listeners to panic, but it does say, hey, this is actually something we need Christians to think about and to be engaged in, and not just to sort of ignore. That would be kind of the irresponsible reaction. The better reaction is, hey, for the sake of my kids and grandkids and the people in my community, I need to actually get up the curve on this.
That's good.
That's a good word there for all of us to be considering, and how to be engaged responsibly so with this. So thank you, and thank you, listeners, for your time, and we will see you next time.
You've been listening to Doxalogic, a podcast by Doxa Church in Rocklin, California. To learn more, visit us online at doxa.church.